Mike's not on.
Opportunity.
Mike's not on.
Switch it
Oh,
on top.
Mike's not on, let's switch it on.
Sometimes when you push the on switch, it works, huh?
Yeah. There you go.
So thank you. Thanks for the introduction, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to everybody for coming out. What I'd like to do is touch on three things. What is this agreement, proposed agreement, and what isn't it? Different strategies for dealing with it. And finally, what can be done about it or to stop it. What I'd like to do is to just share with you first, if you have an interest in some of the sources that I've used. I'm going to quote from numbers of them, and instead of introducing each one, I'll just tell you what they are. The first one is from the U.S. Trade Representative. It's ustr.gov/TPP. The second one is from the AFL-CIO, and you go to aflcio.org/TPP. I have others. One is from a division of the Occupy movement who set up a national commission kind of committee really to develop information about topics, and they have a card here which I will read from and give you access to, which is very useful. In addition, WikiLeaks released one of the 29 chapters they got a hold of, and you can find them at, either at wikileaks.org or theguardian.com/media/2013/November 13th WikiLeaks. They have a 30,000 word chapter of the 29 chapters on intellectual property rights, which I will quote from Assange's summary of, and you're free to go ahead and find what you want. I have found that Public Citizen is the fullest coverage that I have found, and I found them at citizenstrade.org and publiccitizen.org. And for opposition, in addition to Citizen Trade, there's a site called Flush, the TPP.org, and you'll find information about various and sundry organizations that are involved in this. So that's for starters. First of all, what isn't the TPP? Well, it's not really a trade agreement. 4 of the 29 chapters deal with trade, leaving the other 25 for others. Second of all, not a lot is known about it because it's been held in secret. There are 600 corporate representatives from 12 different countries, and the trade representatives, which represent those countries' executive branches in these negotiations, and they have all been secret. If you go to USTR, the trade representative, you'll find their version of the summary of it. And so I downloaded and printed it today. This is a statement of the partners at the last meeting in December 10th of 2013. We, the ministers and heads of delegations for Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, the United States, and Vietnam. This is their brief statement. An ambitious, comprehensive, and high-standard agreement achieves the goals established for creating jobs and promoting growth, providing opportunity for our citizens, and contributing to regional integration and strengthening of the multilateral trading system. Sounds lovely. They have our interests at heart. We can rest easy. Everyone can sleep well. And rest assured that our future is in good hands.
Can I go home now?
Well, if you want to sleep well, but you might miss some useful information. And actually, I want to point in this discussion, or at least my part of it, towards an alternative, as well as look at some of the successes and limitations of what's been achieved, because while it's not new, it's an expansion of what we've seen. So what it's not is a trade agreement. There are 4 of the 29 chapters dealing with trade and tariffs, but the other 25 are not. As I said, we don't know what's in most of them. They have not been made public. People from the Congress, such as I went with a delegation of the Fox Valley Citizens Fox Valley Citizens for Peace and Justice, to our Congresswoman, and she informed us that she was able to see parts of it, but she was not allowed to keep anything in writing. She was not allowed to make any record of it, and she could only see it because she has a security Tammy Duckworth has a security clearance. So Congress people cannot take written materials out of the briefings that they are allowed to, and they don't get to see most of it, and most of it, some sections have nothing in writing whatsoever as according to the latest leaks. So it's very much a work in progress, and as I'll discuss later, and you'll probably be interested in, the focal point for doing something about it is the proposal of the government that they have what's called a fast track. How many people here are familiar with fast track? Oh, I told a joke and didn't know it. Yeah, it's fun. Basically, it says that the Congress gives up the right to have any amendments to the treaty and has to vote for it up or down. And that's been how NAFTA and all the rest of them were passed. And in fact, some of the people involved in making the treaty said that if the American public knew what was in the treaty, there would be no way that it would pass. So they have good reason to keep it secret, just as they've kept secret until they were spied upon and the truth was let out by Assange and by who? Snowden, and also our friend Chelsea Manning, who have done us great favors and to whom we owe an absolute debt of gratitude. By the way, you're able to make, if you want to give WikiLeaks some money, you can do that if you go to their site. I thought it was blocked, but you can actually give them whatever money you think you can afford. So, we know what it's not. We also know that one of the titles for this, that I found, was the Partnership for Strategic Economic Partnership. It's usually known as TPP for the Trans-Pacific, but it's Trans-Pacific. Boy, the words are running away from me. Thank you, Shelley. Strategic Economic Partnership. Strategic having long-term. So I want to come back to strategy and strategic because this is obviously, or clearly, seems to me, part of a long-term strategy of the corporate world with all of their conflicts, with all their competition, with all their differences, with all their struggles against each other for markets and for labor and for profits and for new products and new design and new production techniques and transportation. For all that competition, they also strive to come together to create their world order with their winners and our losers. And some of them will be losers and some of us will be winners, but we know where most of the winning is going to go. So I'm just going to now go into what I found as what is known about what it is. First I'm going to read from the OCU card, and it says they characterize it as a corporate power grab that circumvents domestic judicial systems and undermines national sovereignty. Well, exactly how that works, what they're talking about here is that they have what are called investor state provisions, which have existed under bilateral nation-to-nation agreements. So for example, Australia and Canada have one. And my understanding is that there's a lawsuit for $200 million against the Australian government for doing what? For having prohibition of marketing techniques on their cigarette packages. You can have your name labeled on it, but you can't have your fancy, sexy, successful advertising to appeal to young people to smoke on there. So the cigarette company is suing the Australian government because their limitation on advertising interferes with what they call expected profits. So they can sue under this. One of the proposals of the TPP is that corporations can sue for the loss of quote-unquote expected profits that would be inhibited by existing regulations or laws. So for example, if a company from the United States wanted to go to Japan and build a nuclear power plant, and Japan, God forbid, should have established some new regulations from the recent disastrous experience, an American power company, let's say GE, which builds them, could sue the Japanese government for the loss of expected profits if they had to meet limitations, and vice versa. In other words, the corporations from any of these countries that ratify this pact can make such lawsuits. Now, who would hear these lawsuits? Would they be Supreme Court, federal court? Where would they be heard? Well, actually, they'd be heard by 3-person panels drawn from the lawyers who are quote-unquote on leave from these corporations would hear the lawsuit and make the final judgment, and they would be enforced by the various governments because these would be treaties, and the treaties are signed on the basis that the treaties supersede and cannot be contradicted by local laws. Okay? So that's why they, since that's a provision that the United States and other countries are pushing.
Certain treaties.
Yes, not all treaties, certainly not. But they do exist, and there is an attempt to extend them. The United States government is one of the nations in this 12-country setup that is pushing for this provision. I should add that it's important to keep in mind there is no consensus among these 12 countries on many, many of these points. And in fact, one of the reasons this may very well fail will be the outside pressure from people such as ourselves, unions, community groups, environmental groups, people who are interested in free speech, people who want to keep the internet relatively free for communication. I'll go into these. There are a multitude of reasons that many, many individuals and social groups and organizations can and will be involved in fighting this. But I want to add that there are tremendous divisions among the various countries and the corporations, and that this is by no means should we see this as a done deal that we're just here to mourn. Okay, it's not going to be like that. Any more than the WTO was in 1999 in Seattle. I'm not predicting that there'll be that kind of demonstrations and mass opposition. I have no idea. But it's very clear from 1999 that the mass opposition on the outside, combined with the internal differences from the various countries that disagreed, stymied the expansion of WTO, and there has not been a successful, from their point of view, a successful conclusion of that WTO process. What we're seeing here with TPP is an attempt to extend that process, but no longer through the WTO framework because they've been blocked by these conflicts, the internal contradictions and what I'll call the external contradictions. Let's see. Okay, so that's from the OptiCards. A quick summary from the WikiLeaks. I'll just give you how Assange gives it, because it's 30,000 words. And in those 30,000 words, not only does it summarize the intellectual property rights, which I'll just touch on briefly, but it also shows what are the differences among the different countries are also in there. So if you're interested, it gives you chapter and verse, so to speak. So Assange says, and we'll see, that if instituted, the intellectual property regime would trample over individual rights and free expression, ride roughshod over the intellectual and creative commons. If you read, write, publish, think, listen, dance, sing, or invent, if you farm or consume food, if you're ill now or you might be and one day be ill, the TPP has you in its crosshairs. Well, what are some of the reasons for that? I've given one in terms of the kind of standards that they can have. But for example, these intellectual property rights, the US and some other countries are pushing for an extension of patents on medicines, which now are between 7 and 14 years, to 20 years and more. Which means for those of us, including myself, who take expensive medicines and want generics, I take medicines that, as other people in this room and around this country and the world take, that cost a lot of money, $1, $5, $10 a day. They will block the use of generics for up to 20 years or more. That's just one of the provisions on the so-called property rights. They have patent rights. They want to lower the standards so that people can patent things that are in common use, just as they did with the genetics of the various rice varieties that people developed when they would turn them into property rights and so on and so forth. So that's one. Let's see if I can find one other thing quickly. Copyrights, aggressive measures to prevent protection. No, that's enough for that one. Pardon?
Food labeling.
Food labeling is another, absolutely true. Thank you.
So what does that mean?
That means that limitations such as that say that the food labels have to tell you what's the ingredients, what might be dangerous, what's the level and the amounts of the various chemical composition, could be labeled as obstructive, and they could be done away with.
There'll be no GMO labeling.
And that would be one of the things that they would be able to stop GMO labeling and all kinds of warning, including possibly they could go after the warnings on cigarettes, that cigarettes are dangerous to your health. All these kinds of protections that you don't even think about, that you take for granted, that are part of daily life, that were won as a result of the struggles of the environmental and the social movements of the 60s and 70s, which is 40, 50 years ago now. This is a one-way ticket out. Some of the areas that are dealing with is market access for dairy, sugar, clothes, rice, all kinds of food goods are some of the things that are up for trade. The regulations that they would do away with, or they would set up in the crosshairs, would be energy, financial regulation. One of the important things is the U.S. and some of the other countries are pushing for an end to financial regulations, such as some of these countries have limitations on how much money can be taken out of the country, how fast, so that their currency aren't whipsawed and broken by speculators. Banking regulations that are just barely a few of them, some going into effect after the bankers stole so much money in this country and bankrupted hundreds and thousands of people and lost their homes and so on and so forth. Those regulations would be in the crosshairs as well, because they would be obstructive of intended profits. Environmental standards. We have, on the books anyway, we have standards to protect clean air, clean water. Those are also limitations.
Endangered species.
Endangered species would be another. All kinds of limitations and regulations that deal with our food, our environment, our health, our air, our water, jobs, possibly minimum wage, obstruction, and so on and so forth. It's quite extensive, and it has an appetite that shows no signs of slacking. And perhaps instead of their appetite in their mouth being open, they need something shoved in their mouth to curb their appetite, at least.
A bit. What would that be? A bit.
Well, I see a fist in the back. That's a start. Someone show me their boot. A fist or a boot.
Steel toes.
Steel toes, even better. But we're not advocating anything, of course. We're just observing the varied response of the people here. Let's see if I can give you some more. Too much here. This is from Public Citizen. Foreign investor rules that facilitate job offshore would be facilitated, and labor rights. Many of the countries are all for putting in sections on labor rights. You may be surprised, but almost all of them are against any enforcement provisions. So they want to do the right thing, and their heart's in the right place, and so that's another reason we can go home and rest easy. And so can the younger people who are looking for work, because we're all going to gain from this. We're all in this together. Or so they would tell us.
Wait, it says we can sue, though, if our profits have been imperiled.
Well, that's right. And as soon as you form a multinational corporation and hire international lawyers, and you can make a case, I think you should go ahead and do that. I mean, this is a free country, and you have that right, absolutely.
You have a right to spend your money.
Or sleep under a bridge.
So we're all right to enter into these. So, okay. I can see this as a very hostile audience, and I'm going to have a hard time making a case for this. So please, I'm old and frail. Don't be easy on me. But I do want to see what factual information I can give you along with having fun. Let's see. Another illustration of the difficulties that they're having with it, along with the provisions that I want to bring to your attention, is this point from Public Citizen. Ben Beachy is their research director with Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, and he points out entire chapters of the TPP remain even without a draft. They're so contentious that they remain without a draft. And yet, there is a motion before both houses to have fast track to give authorization for the vote up and down. And the purpose of this is to preclude any ability to make amendments, as I said, which is a selling point for the administration This is a priority of this administration since 2010, and no surprise, continues the expansion of these attempted international globalization by the corporations to set up frameworks to bypass even the very limited impact of elected governments and legal and laws to become a supranational, S-U-P-R-A, supra, above national, their own international framework, to bypass the legalities once they get authorization, and fast track is the key to that authorization. So at the same time, in a few minutes I want to go into some of the drive behind that and the two strategies from the two different fundamental analysis of that, but let's see what else we can find here. This is from Citizens Trade. The bank regulations that I mentioned, the capital controls that I mentioned, the patent protections, the extension, the inability to negotiate lower medicine costs. So for example, the U.S. government would be limited even if they wanted to, even if we elected a government that wanted to negotiate lower costs for the pharmaceuticals in the industries, in the medicines that are covered, they would be precluded from doing that. And so they have this investor-state system that I mentioned to you. Some of the examples where lawsuits are being brought on existing treaties. The United States, by the way, has 20 bilateral treaties with various some of these regulations impact. Australia's tobacco controls I mentioned. Germany's phasing out nuclear energy. Corporations such as GE are free to, and some have begun suing Germany over their policy of closing down their nuclear industry because it would interfere with their expected profits in building nuclear power plants and supplying them. Another threat of such a lawsuit is over Costa Rica because, now this is a terrible thing, this is really an oppressive government. They have laws that limit what gold mining can do to the environment and the ecology, and so there's a threatened lawsuit over the impact of a proposed gold mine there. So some more examples of what this means. I think that gives some of the major, I won't say the highlights, maybe the lowlights of what the trade partnership is. And what I'd like to do is examine what the AFL-CIO, which is the major organization that still has over something like 13 million members and has extensive contacts with religious organizations, community-based organizations, environmental organizations in this country and around the world. And so they are a major player. They don't define the breadth of this movement opposed to these treaties, but they are a central player, and I wanted to address their point of view on this because I think it deserves it, both for the strengths and the weaknesses. So this I downloaded from you go to AFL-CIO/TPP. This is a statement that I downloaded and printed this morning, and it, here's their take on it. The trade agreement meaning TPPs, the trade agreement presents the Obama administration with an opportunity to reform U.S. trade policy so it helps U.S. businesses export goods rather than outsource jobs. The President can deliver a new trade model for the 21st century that creates jobs, protects the environment, and ensures safe imports, but only if negotiations include provisions that will benefit U.S. workers, not simply the largest global corporations. The AFL-CIO has provided the administration with ideas about how to improve the U.S. trade positions so they work for the 99%, not just the 1%. Unfortunately, it is an uphill battle. The corporate global agenda has infused trade policy with its demands for deregulation, privatization, tax breaks, and other financial advantages for big businesses while shrinking the social safety net in the name of labor flexibility. And then it goes on to say why things don't look good, and it looks again as if the global corporations are having too much influence in the process. So their basic outlook is expressed in these words, and it's also an expression of their general strategic partnership, junior partnership with industry and with the corporations to guarantee their profits and to get as much as they can for labor in the process of doing that. And their proposal and their practice for these many years has been that this is the only thing that we can do under the circumstances of the current system of which we are a part, not looking beyond it, and in fact working within it. And it's that particular strategy that guides much of the opposition, which proposes the alternative of fair trade on the basis that they said here. That is to say, proposing exports to produce more export-based jobs, to create jobs, protect the environment, ensure safe imports, and so on, based on being able to show that this is in a mutual interest, allegedly. So I'd like to take a quick look, or maybe not so quick look, at what has actually been the practice over the last 40 years, let alone the last 2 centuries, of this strategy, which has been a consistent and usually the dominant practice and point of view in the labor movement and in much of the opposition movement. This idea that both can benefit, that we can do this together if we get it right. Well, first of all, in terms of one of the things that we faced has been the lowering of what's called labor density or union density. That is 30%, 35% actually in 1959 of the American workforce was unionized, and I think it's about 11% overall, and in the private sector it's about 9%. So the numbers are down significantly, both and the weight of the union movement, which has fundamentally fought for things such as the 8-hour day and 5-day week and health and safety provisions and anti-discriminatory provisions and so on and so forth. All these things that maybe people of a certain age might take for granted or have experienced and lived through, which are not available to growing numbers of people and young people today. These losses are real, and the AFL-CIO's policy of collaborating and looking for joint resolutions with management has borne little, if any, fruit, except bitter fruit. I think it's not just a mistake, but it's rather a reflection of their having a stake, a role, and rewards in the present system, and it can be seen by both their failure to extend solidarity and fight, but also their active undermining of the resistance that the working class has shown over the last 30, 40 years. And I'll just take a few examples. One will be PATCO, the professional air traffic controllers, who when they went on strike after a short while were fired by President Reagan. Most of us don't know the fact that Jimmy Carter, as the Democrat, drew up the plans for breaking the PATCO strike when he was president, and the threat was carried out by Reagan. During that strike, there were enormous calls for a general strike. Enormous. Local unions, city federations, state federations, were calling for it. In Massachusetts, they had a convention, and it was unanimous of all the delegates, from the width and the breadth of the political outlooks and the backgrounds and the skill levels, and so on and so forth. A unanimous call for a general strike to be called by the AFL-CIO. But in fact, of course, they didn't call it. I have a personal experience at the Chicago level here with that. 8 of us met in my living room during that strike. Included Sharon McCarthy, who was at that time a steel worker and active at Southworks, with her fellow workers and in the union. We had postal workers, we had clerical workers, we had teachers, we had construction workers. We had people from many different, and we established connections with people around the city who we knew from radical activities, both political and economic, union and non-union. And we proposed, and I called the regional representative from PATCO and proposed to him that we have a downtown rally and that we have a car caravan out to O'Hare. On the side, we had contacts with some firemen who were very upset with the city administration, who had been giving them a hard time in negotiations and didn't want to treat them fairly. And they put some of us, myself included, in touch with people who worked at O'Hare. We went out there privately and met with people who took care of the airplanes, ramp rats, ticket agents, all kinds of repair people, airline mechanics, who had their own grievances and would have been more than happy and expressed their willingness to go out on a one-day wildcat strike and shut O'Hare down when we took our caravan out there. So actually I have no idea how much happened in other cities, but I know this happened because I was part of it. And then a few days before the downtown rally and the car caravan was supposed to take place, and word was spreading, because there was an unhappiness with the current situation in many, many, many workplaces, in auto plants, in steel mills, in small factories. The radicalization that took place in the civil rights movement, then in the black liberation movement in the North, and in the anti-war movement, and then among soldiers and sailors and people in intelligence inside the military against the war in Vietnam, and increasingly among substantial numbers against what we consider to be the imperialist system of which the war was a part. The imperial corporate system attempting to dominate and exploit the people and the resources of the earth, which is what we saw it as. This was growing, and this was also reflected in the plants, where you had revolutionary black workers, where you had white GIs who'd come back who were sympathetic but had their own issues and wanted to fight the auto companies. There were all kinds of these things going on. There was a reform movement inside the steel workers where more militant and a very class-conscious guy, Eddie Sadlowski, ran. There was a wildcat postal strike in '71 which shut down the country's postal system. All these kinds of things were taking place, and so it wasn't by any means squelched or shut down by any means, and there was still a lot of this. And the union, the head of the AFL-CIO here, was Robert Healy, who had led many militant teacher strikes when they were not legally recognized and had gone to jail for it, told the guy who was the head of PATCO, whose name I've forgotten, that if you deal with these radicals, if you go speak at this rally, if you endorse this, the AFL-CIO will shut down its offices, you will be kicked out of your offices, you will not have access to the organizations or to the workplaces where you took up collections, we let you take up collections, it'll all be cut off, you are not to have anything to do with these people. And this is one example of the active role of the leadership of many of the unions in squelching the alternatives that existed that would have been big challenges. And I'll just give you one other example. That was 1981. We go back 3 years to 2011 in Wisconsin. That's the year that Governor Walker introduced the proposals to not only basically limit bargaining to wages and benefits and nothing else, but we eliminated the dues collection system for the unions. But also those proposals, and which became law, included taking away the benefits for the state health care, which people who were unemployed would be getting, people who were long-term unemployed out of the workforce, small business people, farmers in the state of Wisconsin depended on this, and also cutting education spending. So you had health benefits and education benefits along with union rights. So there was a widespread impact on the working class, the poor, and many of people that might be considered lower middle class or small business. And the basis existed, and sentiment developed, and I happen to be part of it, so I know this personally. A number of us put forward in the streets in Wisconsin flyers and conversations and small meetings about the possibility of a statewide strike that would be both to protect the social benefits but also the union rights combined. And the numbers of people who were impacted were such that the people who came out, how many people here in this room were at Madison at any one time? That's great. That's half the people in this room. So you know from your own experience that it wasn't, quote unquote, just state workers who were out there. There were private sector workers, there were union workers and non-union workers, there were housewives, there were teachers, there were students. It was all over the place. And I can speak from personal experience. I went around, I was with 3 friends one day on the second day of this whole action, which was on a Tuesday, and a guy came up and said, "We need a general strike." Now usually I hear general strike, general strike. You hear it, it's like, praise God, praise God, praise God. It's just a formula. It's not necessarily meaningful, but in this circumstance, when we started to put out leaflets about it, and the only people who would put them out was the IWW, none of the other groups would touch it at the time. And one of the founders of this Open University of the Left, David Williams, personally passed out over 4,000 flyers the first week. And I talked to dozens, if not 100 people, myself and other people were doing the same, to explain what is a general strike, what is a statewide strike, who could do it, how would it be done, who would you have to organize for it. And people who had never heard of it thought, that's a brilliant idea, that's just what we need. Shut this place down and show them that Wisconsin won't work if you do this to us. Then the union stepped in. The state unions, the two major state unions were AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, of which I was and still am a part here in Chicago, and the teachers. So the state teachers union president and the state AFSCME president immediately said, upon confronted with these laws, we will not oppose the social cuts. We will not oppose the cuts to education and health care, but we want to protect dues collection and bargaining rights. So immediately they wanted to cut that loose because, well, I won't go into because why, because I can't speak for them, but it's public record that they did that. Secondly, as momentum was beginning to gather for a general strike, for a statewide strike, the president of the building trades in the Madison area participated in the weekly meetings of the state union leadership in that capacity. Eric, I've forgotten his last name. He reported to a union conference called by Labor Notes in the spring of 2011, after most of the demonstrations and mobilizations were over. He reported that he raised this question of a general strike at the statewide union leadership because he said, well, what else are we going to do? They were talking about, we're going to challenge this in elections, we're going to have recall elections, it'll take a year or two, but that's how we're going to block this. They couldn't overturn it. They couldn't have possibly gotten a majority of the state legislature to overturn it because there are not that many seats were at risk. But that was the way they wanted to channel the energy. And when he brought this up, he reported what their response was. And the response was very quick. They understood exactly what was at stake. And they said, they will take our union treasuries, and they will put us in jail. It ain't going to happen, forget about it. The end. So I raise this to illustrate, just from a few experiences, the role of the union leaders at the higher levels, state and national levels, to undermine, to stop, to block, and to channel into quote-unquote safe directions. That is part and parcel, in my experience and in my outlook on things, of what this philosophy that was expressed briefly in their statement on the AFL-CIO about providing the administration with ideas about how to improve the trade positions, about an opportunity to reform trade policy so that business export jobs and protects the environment. It might, from a certain perspective, look like wishful thinking, or it might reflect a relationship of partnership in maintaining the status quo and in having a stake in doing that and in suppressing, repressing, and marginalizing the alternatives. So I want to turn to strategic alternatives and argue that the AFL-CIO's strategy of advising the administration and pressuring it to do the right thing cannot work, and in fact is perhaps hypocritical. And I want to turn to two people, one of whom most of you have heard of. Many of you have heard of Karl Marx, am I right? How many people here have heard of even read something of Karl Marx?
Model railroads, right?
Pardon me?
Model railroads?
Model railroads, yep.
He was in Duck Soup.
He was in what?
Duck Soup.
Duck Soup.
Yeah.
Karl Marx.
Right.
I remember the Marx Brothers.
Right.
Karl and Harpo and all those guys.
Yeah.
Toot toot, right? That guy.
That was him.
That was him. That was Karl hiding his Harpo, a.k.a. Harpo. Okay, you old people, let's stop this. We're having too much fun. But the other, so I will call Marx a strategist from the point of view of working class revolution and a new classless society, and a democratic, what he would call immensely democratic. And another one is a corporate lawyer who is also a strategist, who became a Supreme Court justice, who was a very successful international corporate lawyer, so successful that his wife was adamant and really had to be dragged to the Supreme Court. She loved her life traveling the world. He was an extremely successful and a very clear strategic thinker. How many people know this gentleman who I'm going to talk about? Lewis Powell. If you haven't, Google Lewis, L-E-W-I-S, Lewis Powell memo. He wrote a memo. I have before me 12 of the 34 pages because it's too much for my printer and I wasn't going to read it all again. And he wrote a memo dated August 23rd, 1971 to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It is, in my very humble opinion, but nevertheless my opinion, that it is a perfect model of strategic thinking, clear analysis, concrete proposals to defend and advance his class's interest, of which he was a part and a strategic thinker for. And I think that the only way we're going to have any success in going beyond we're against this, we're against this, we're against this, and stopping this, is in the process of fighting for ourselves and our common interests as we fight such things as this TPP, which I will discuss later, that we build into it and we seek to explain wherever we can and however we can the nature of capitalism as driving this as the modern expansion of the capitalist prerogatives, no more than prerogatives, needs. I had a little phrase for it. Oh, corporate greed or capitalist need. Corporate greed is usually the phrase that's used for the perspective that they're just greedy. They should be shown that being greedy is unproductive for their long-term interests, that we have a common interest in a reasonable, fair-minded capitalist expansion, which appeared to be successful in the period post-World War II, when there was a rising standard of living among much of the working class, not all, mostly white with some black, but not much, and in which standard of living was going up, the purchasing power was going up, the housing, education, healthcare, all that was rising for large sections of the American working class, lower middle class. And it appeared that this partnership policy was bearing fruit. But ever since the early 70s, for the last 40 years, there's only one direction to this for most. There are some winners in the working class as well. There are some people who get very good paying jobs, such as in Silicon Valley, and you may be interested in the fight against the gentrification taking place out there. There are other winners, of course there are. But the large majority, 70% or more, are frozen in place or going downhill, and our children are facing 2/3 of all the jobs that are created are dead end, low benefit, low wage jobs that are going nowhere. And their future is much worse. And so the direction of things tilts. And I want to take up Lewis Powell briefly, and again encourage you to read this for yourself, because he starts by saying, no thoughtful person can question that the American economic system is under broad attack, whether it's called the free enterprise system, capitalism, or the profit system. And he takes pains to go into the attack and the sources of the attack, to identify the nature of the problem, then to make a diagnosis of the problem, and then to offer strategic and tactical ways to implement the strategic response that he advocates. So I'm not going to read a lot of it, but I really do want to emphasize that it's very useful, and I want to see if I can find my quotes. And to go into the source, what the conditions were, he says, for example, a recent poll of students on 12 representative campuses. This is an editorial in the Richmond Times-Dispatch of July 7th of '71. He says, the recent poll reported that almost half the students favored socialization of basic U.S. industries, which sounds like another time and another place, one that may be faintly remembered by some of us in the audience, or maybe even vividly. But then I thought, well, you know, it's just a few years ago that the Pew poll polled the American population and said, would you rather be living under socialism or under capitalism? 52%, if I remember the right figures right, said capitalism. 38%, 3 out of 8 said socialism, whatever they meant by that. But it's indicative of the fact that the anti-capitalist, or the desire for a socialist or a more egalitarian social supports, whatever socialism meant to those people, it didn't mean the unfettered, unregulated capitalism that we're experiencing, and the growing and the breadth of the attacks on the species of the world, the infrastructure of the world, the ecology of the world, the acidification of the oceans, and so on and so forth, the growing collapse or undermining of the very basis of much of life and civilization on Earth, is a growing crisis such as the depths and the breadth of which I doubt that we've seen. These are unprecedented, some of these. So he says it's crystal clear, quoting from Milton Friedman of the University of Chicago, it's crystal clear that the foundations of our free society are under wide-ranging and powerful attack, not by the communist or other conspiracy, but by, he means us here, misguided individuals parroting one another and unwittingly serving ends they would never intentionally promote. See what a liberal guy he was? Misunderstood by the left, not appreciated for the humane person that he really was. So, then he goes into the apathy and default of business, much as I have attempted in a very tiny way to go into the, what did he call it? Into the apathy and default of the union movement. And then he goes on to say, what can we do? And he quotes a column in the Wall Street Journal that says, was titled, Memo to GM, Why Not Fight Back? And so then he goes into what needs to be done to fight back. And one of the things that he proposes is, and I'll stop here, is a strategic outlook that the corporation executives and the major stockholders get behind a concerted push to put in time and money and resources, to put up special people on their boards of directors whose job it is to push forward the point of view that American capitalism, free enterprise, is in the interest of everybody, to change the intellectual discussion in the country, to attack the basis of their opposition so that what used to be called the safety net became known as entitlements. Bad word, bad idea, you're entitled to anything. What, you think free air is good for you? Oh, clean air is good for you? You're entitled to free air? No, 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 no. How does it fit into the profit system? So he proposed the organizational means through the Chamber of Commerce and the other Chamber of Commerces, and then the development of think tanks to develop platforms and programs. Heritage Foundation, think of any number of think tanks that are out there. You want to think it's the Koch brothers who are doing it all? No, the Koch brothers are part of a much larger movement to take back the minds of the people of this country, and then to institute the policies that would end up the regulations that were crimping their profits. So we had deregulated industries in the 70s and the 80s, the privatization of government functions from the military, which I have no idea, maybe some people here can share it with us in the discussion, the amount of the privatization in the military, from providing foods to guards for the embassies to private shock battalions that were used in New Orleans, Blackwater, you name it. I have no idea the extension of it, but I do know that Al Gore and the president of the International Union, of which I was a part of, asked me. Al Gore chaired a committee on, I don't remember, they had a nice euphemism for it in the 90s. He chaired a committee on the privatization of government services, and in AFSCME's paper at one point, they bragged that they had privatized 350,000 full-time federal government jobs alone. So this is in part a result of this call to arms to put resources and to be long view, to take a long view of things. And I'll just take a look. I have a quote here for you if I can find it briefly. What specifically should be done? The first essential, a prerequisite to any effective action, a prerequisite, is for businessmen to confront this problem as a primary responsibility of corporate management. A primary responsibility. The ultimate issue may be survival of what we call the free enterprise system. And then he goes into the possible role for the Chamber of Commerce. And he goes into how every individual corporation should have a vice president on the board whose job is to put time, energy, and money and resources into changing the direction of the country and to explaining to the country, quote unquote, that this is in the best interest of everybody. But then he goes on to say independent, and I would say this is useful for us and any organizations we're part of, and any mobilizations, and any conversations, independent and uncoordinated activity by individuals such as my doing this, as important as this is, will not be sufficient. Strength lies in organization, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, in the scale of financing through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action and national organizations. That's on page 11 if you want to look for it. It's a model of clarity and elegance and simplicity of thought and what needs to be done. And so from that, I want to take off and use him as a springboard to talk about what Mr. Marx might have to contribute to our perspective. Question of strategic outlook, the question of promoting the class interest, the question of taking individual, in his case corporate, in our case otherwise, individual responsibility and individual initiative, but doing it in a long-term basis and on an organized basis is what. Now if we look at this from the perspective that fundamentally, not only, but fundamentally, this is an expansion of exploitation globally and the need to expand power to do that, and the need to bypass regulations and laws and inhibiting factors. If that's truly what TPP is a part of and expresses, then the alternative to that is building towards a society in which the people who work for a living and who are integrated into the international economy. And if we looked at the shoes and the shirts that we have on our feet and our backs right now, how many countries, the coordinated labor of people in how many countries, how many people around the world in how many countries contributed to putting those shoes together and putting those shirts on our back? How many? Anybody? 50? 100? If we looked at the labels and then we examined who did the transportation, right? We're talking about an integrated global economy, and I was going to read from Marx and read from Marx. I won't read from Marx. I won't read from Marx.
So what is to be done?
Unless there's... Actually, Powell uses the phrases, what can be done? But he says, what can be realistically done? Anyway, it's a good question, Shell, and we'll see if we can get to it. I would say, let me just take a look here 1 second.
And don't forget the adverse, realistically.
I'm looking at time. I'm going to give myself 10 minutes to finish. I'll just say that Marx's analysis is that the problem is that basically our society, like all previous societies of which there are records going back 7,000 to 10,000 years, are class societies that are fundamentally based on some class appropriating what other people produce, whether it's through slavery, whether it's through colonialism, or whatever the form of it is. And it's clearly evident that more and more of the wealth is going into fewer and fewer hands as poverty grows in this country. What is it, 3 out of 8 kids are living in poverty. We have, the statistics are just massive and overwhelming. The richest 40 people in this country have wealth which exceeds that of 100 million people, something like that. The richest 85 people in the world have wealth that is worth all the wealth of over 2,000 million people, over 2 billion people in the world, 85 richest. So it's not just a matter of they have money and we don't have as much, it's when the pinch begins to hurt that it makes a difference and that people really get angry. And we saw it in Occupy, the movement of Occupy, which was saying the problem is the 1% have the wealth and the power. It's the fact that the wealth really most people could care less if somebody else is rich and they live in a magnificent home with private swimming pools, as long as they or we have what we consider basic necessaries and a decent future and a decent life. Really most people could care less, you know. But when the pinch is on and they're sitting on tons, and then we discover, find out, learn, and see that they have power, that wealth translates to power that can then be influenced, and we talked about the introduction was bought and paid for politicians. Well, where's that wealth coming from that buys and pays for them? According to Marx and perhaps practical experience, people only hire people in a business if they think they're going to make money off of them, directly or indirectly. You don't hire people. I mean, even I had a small business. I had I had a truck, and when I needed 2 or 3 people for the job, I hired 2 or 3 other people. I didn't really hire them and pay them more than they brought in for me. I might break even, or I might make money, but I wasn't hiring to lose money. If I'm going to accumulate money, the more people work for me, the more money I'm going to make, because I'm going to make some money that I don't pay them back. Marx had different language for it, but I think that's what it boils down to in terms of appropriation of surplus value. So if that's true, that that's the fundamental, not the only, but the fundamental driving force in the capitalist relationships of life, Marx went out of his way not just to analyze theoretically how it worked, but he took heart from and learned from the attempts of working people, what he would call ordinary, what we might call ordinary working people. I don't like the word ordinary. It's like, there are extraordinary people and there are ordinary people. Oh, bullshit. People are people. Huh?
Typical, that's a good word.
Typical people?
Yeah.
Are you a typical people?
You bet.
Okay, you bet. I'm a typical people too. Right on, brother. Typical People United. Would that be TPU? So,
That means we all have types.
oh, we all have TP. So, I like to have fun, but I'm easily distracted too, so my enemies distract me and so do my friends. But Marx also took heed of the actual activities of the working class. And so the manifesto was written in response to a German revolutionary workers group as a manifesto of what they believed in and what they wanted to achieve, because they participated in, as did Marx and Engels, in the revolutions of 1848. And that's where he ran across the fact that there were working men's societies that were discussing the nature of society, what needed to be done, and so on and so forth. And he discovered in them, in those working men's societies, what Hegel talked about in terms of an abstract dialectic. That is a reaction within the capitalist system itself, that capitalism cannot exist without a working class, and the working class has distinct needs, including, if we're to be free of the domination and the manipulation of others, to end the system of class exploitation, which will mean freedom for tons of other people, as well as other benefits as well. And then he took heart from that, and he learned that, and he used that in his economics as well, and especially the Paris Commune. How many people here are familiar with the Paris Commune? Almost everybody, of course. However, that's not true for everybody who might watch this on TV, so we'll just briefly say that the Paris Commune was an uprising in which the existing form of government, which was of the French government, was their control was pushed back, and they formed their own government. They formed their own society called the Commune, in which representatives were elected who were paid working men's wages, who could be recalled at any time, who had to give reports on not just the laws that they passed, but what they did to implement them. And so the function of government became working people's jobs, and they reported to the collective or the group, the assembly that elected them, and they began to take steps to transfer society into their own hands and into their common good. And they started with some simple things like canceling the debts that were owed to landlords from the previous winter when people were unemployed and there was a war going on. And they took practical steps. Now they lasted, a few months before the French government brought the army in and overwhelmed them and massacred about 25,000 people. But that was an uprising that was more clearly defined, and it also showed the form, which would be a democratic, massively democratic, available government, as opposed to electing a representative every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years, and having judges that you couldn't directly control and that had jobs for life, and so on and so forth, and military. So it was in the hands, and it was visible and what we would call transparent. And that also showed that the Marxist tradition also then looked at the revolution of 1905 in Russia, where workers set up councils of elected representatives to establish power. What are we going to do in the city? How are we going to deal with bread? Where are we going to get the resources? What are we going to produce? How are we going to produce it? How are we going to distribute it? To take the leadership of society into their own hands. Not because someone told them to do it, because that was a response to the conditions in which they found themselves. So I'm not going to argue beyond that. I'm not going to go into arguments for what kind of party we should have, or should it be anarchist, or should it be communist, or should it be democratic, or should it be... That's beyond the discussion here. If someone wants to bring it up, fine. Only to point out that the conditions that are bringing about TPP down our path into our pocketbook, into our jobs, into our health care, into our medicines, into the air that we breathe and the water that we drink, is part of this expansion of corporate capital and their necessity to deal with the integrated world market before they get left behind as individuals, and that they're doing this together, and that our possibility lies in infusing any opposition with this understanding of building an anti-capitalist liberation movement, or whatever you want to call it, rather than just say no. Because just saying no won't get you very far. Are there any sports fans here? Anybody watch the Super Bowl? No, you didn't even watch the Super Bowl? Somebody watched the Super Bowl. Okay,
I'm a
good.
sports fan. I would watch
Okay.
that Super Bowl.
Okay. But what we saw was there's a defense is necessary. We have such clowns in this audience, oh my God. Any sports, any competitive sports, whether it's basketball, football, hockey, field hockey, whatever, lacrosse, what else? What?
Marbles.
All these, yeah. Fine, thank you. Require defense and offense. And to use that analogy, perhaps not perfectly, we do need to have a defense. We can't just sit back and say, well, comes the revolution, we're going to do this, or comes the future, we're going to do this. We have to make the future with whatever time and energies we have available to us. And it seems to me quite clear that the strategy of advising the government, advising the administration, which Marx called the executive branch of elected governments to be the executive committee of the ruling classes. And it's no accident that the police, to go on a tangent, the police all around the country, in democratic cities as well as Republican, dispersed, broke up, and illegally dismantled the Occupy movements, where there were mass public meetings, choosing of points of view, giving reports from committees about carrying out work against occupations and all kinds of things. In other words, I'm not going to try and say it was the Commune of Paris or it was the 1848 uprising, but there were elements of it that for the first time people participated in group activities around meaningful issues where they could have a say, where they could get reports from the people that they chose, and that they felt empowered, and that this was attractive, that 70% of the people in the United States supported the goals and what was understood Occupy was about, that it attracted police, retired police officers in their white uniforms who got up in New York City and said at public meetings, most of the police officers in this country, from my personal experience, I can attest that they work for, with, and they're completely in collusion with the corporate and the private banking interests and stuff like that, that's who they connect with, they communicate with, they get Christmas presents from, they socialize with, and so on and so forth. There were soldiers and Marines in uniform who came to New York and stood between the Occupy people and the police to protect the Occupy people as uniformed soldiers. The divisions in the ruling class and their opposition and their apparatus began to become effective, immediate, visible. That the promise of these kinds of movements guided by this is immense. And I'll just finish by saying that I think that from the sources that I've found, the opposition to TPP and to fast track are very wide, they're very broad, and the divisions within the 12 countries are very deep, and it is absolutely feasible, in my very limited knowledge of this and imagination, that we will both be able to defeat this. But it is also, and perhaps from Lewis Powell's perspective, from a strategic perspective, it is absolutely necessary that if we're going to have a hope for a future besides defending, if we're going to have an offense, that we participate in such a way that we bring these things up in a reasonable but in a very persistent way, as he advised us to do. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
We have about 35 minutes for Q&A.
And the way it works, if you're not familiar with this, is you go to the microphone and say whatever you want to say.
Thank you, Earl. Thank you for a very enlightening and detailed
discussion. I don't know if anybody here has ever done any reading or studying about the way the World Bank works, but particularly starting in the 70s when countries would suffer, some third world countries would suffer a terrible economic situation. They would have to borrow money in order to buy medicine and to be able to, for their citizens to survive. And once they were in debt to the World Bank, the system was actually pretty simple. The World Bank said, yes, we will put you on a schedule to repay these monies you borrowed, but in addition, since we have you by the balls, you have to nationalize, we are going to bring in some friends of ours and you have to sell off your national assets, even though these national assets really weren't being sold to repay the debt. National assets like commonly held things like utilities and water treatment centers and national parks and things like that. When this system happened, it kind of reminds me of the silent movie where the evil banker Snidely Whiplash threatens to foreclose the mortgage on the tenant's home if he doesn't offer up his daughter in marriage. And the daughter being in marriage, marrying the daughter doesn't repay the debt. It only serves the personal greed of the money lender. It's a similar situation with the World Bank. And I bring this up because this is what the TPP is going to bring to all the countries that join it, and maybe some of the countries that don't, without having to be in debt to anybody. The situation will be that any corporation that wants to come and nationalize a commonly held asset, like a national park or a water utility or anything like that, all they have the government entity that holds this common asset can either sell the asset to the international corporation, or they can be sued, as Earl says. And I want to take a possible extreme example, but one that's not in any way out of the realm of possibility for the TPP. Suppose Nestle comes along and says to the city of Chicago that we want to buy the Chicago water department?
Reclamation district.
The reclamation district. So we want to buy that. And of course, the city council has to debate it. And if the city council says, no, we're not going to sell to Nestle, you all know Nestle sells a lot of bottled water under a number of different brands. And a lot of times this bottled water is just tap water, but that's beside the point. So if the city council votes on it and says no, then Nestle can sue the city of Chicago, not just the reclamation district. They can sue the city of Chicago because that's what the city council represents. And they can sue for, there's no limitation in the TPP for how much they can sue. And it doesn't go to a court, it goes to, as Earl said, a three-person panel made up of lawyers who are on leave from international corporations. So this brings about what is called the toll gate economy, which is actually where I should have started. Something that's a little more familiar to people in the third world, but will become the situation in this country and many, if not all other countries, as capitalism marches onward, which means that instead of paying a few dollars a month or nothing for your water, you have to pay every time you put on the tap. And instead of there being controls on how much you pay for gas or electricity, it'll be whatever the market can bear, which means a lot of people won't have any. And suppose as a last example, suppose the people who bought the Chicago Skyway, suppose they say they want to buy the expressway system in all of Illinois. And the Illinois state legislature has the choice of either turning them down and being sued for an unspecified, possibly unlimited amount of money, because under the law, investors, particularly investors from other countries or from transnational corporations, can sue over the phantom potential possibility of expected profits. The expected profits from turning every road, municipal, state, and national, into a toll road in this state, That's an enormous amount of profit that the management company who bought the Chicago Skyway can sue for if the state legislature turns them down. And every time we go anywhere, we're going to have to pay a toll. This is the model that the TPP is going to open the way for, and this is the dream of the international capitalists who, as Earl mentioned, already own an outsized segment of the wealth in this country. And this is an opportunity for international capital to control in ways that are hard to imagine. And I don't think I've been overly shrill in bringing up these examples of selling off things like the municipal water supply or the roads, or possibly, who knows, it may not stop there. Maybe they can charge us for breathing air, where we all have to pay a monthly fee for that too. So I know this is sort of alarmist, but I wanted to make clear that there's no limit to, and there's nothing too ridiculous in the Trans-Pacific Partnership when it comes to changing the laws such that the little bit of assets and the little bit of control that governments have in terms of holding any kind of commons will be eliminated. I just want to end with one last quick example. Liberals they lose control of their bodily functions and how happy they are over the Pure Food and Drug Act, the story of over 100 years ago when Teddy Roosevelt read the Jungle. Instead of understanding it, he went and enacted a whole bunch of legislation about food and drugs. It won't be the end of the Pure Food and Drug Act. It'll just be the end of any enforcement for the Pure Food and Drug Act, and there won't be any controls over the food, over the purity and sanitation of the food we eat, or the effectiveness or the safety of the drugs we take. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you. You're welcome to reply in any way if you see fit.
Far from shrill. I think that you've given us some more examples to think about what this will mean in the application should it pass. I mean, I think the key thing is that it's profitable to make things into commodities. Anything that can be bought and sold can be made a profit from. Anything that's a public good or a common good or common existence cannot be profited from, certainly not so easy. So the need to commodify is inherent in the expansion of business, profits, corporate reach, whatever you want to call it. And I just think your examples hit home to anybody who thinks about it for a minute. When you were talking, it reminded me that the home I grew up in the Grand Crossing, a little neighborhood no one ever heard of on the south side, took place when they built the Skyway. And they used, I think it was in Boston not long ago, they had an example where they used eminent domain, the power of the government to take over private holdings for public good, was exercised on behalf of private corporations. And we're seeing the internationalization and the attempt to globalize exactly that. But I do want to emphasize, in addition to what you said, all of which fits with everything I've learned recently, that this is not a done deal, and what people do will make a difference. And Fast Track is the first opening on that. And yeah, that's all I want to say.
Yeah, a good benefit then should be that we'll have to move the drug users out of our prisons, put the water thieves in there.
Yeah, that's right.
Earl, you mentioned a couple times, 40 years, the Powell Memo. Powell Memo was written in 1971. There was a huge flurry of events taking place in 1971. We went off the gold standard. They made a deal with the oil producers that they would trade in dollars. And of course the Trilateral Commission was formed. So a whole lot of activity took place then. The Bretton Woods was abolished so they could get something with teeth in it, which is these trade agreements, these free trade agreements. And I was in Seattle in '99 when we opposed the WTO. But I see these agreements as a stage. We have to look at what the ultimate goal is, I think, to know how best to attack it. And what the ultimate goal is global government. And some of these people, Richard, Levi Strauss, like that, have talked about abolishing the nation states. So there'll be one national government. Walter Wriston, who was CEO of Citigroup, wrote Twilight of Sovereignty. So there's going to be a government of about a few thousand people, and I assume they gave Obama a promise for a seat, and I think they gave Hillary a promise of a seat if they behave properly in their positions of power. But if we're going to try to stop this, and this is one of the reasons they don't care if they bankrupt this country. They want all nation states to be ruined. And the disasters that take place, that's fine with them. You know, you and I, we're alarmed. Hey, our country's being ruined. Our air's being ruined. We're all going to have to go around with oxygen masks on here soon. And only people who can afford oxygen will be able to breathe. Seem to where they're going. Why don't they mind? The people that, and they mention Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History. They're talking about the end of things the way they are. So, how do we attack? Another thing Citigroup came up with. They came up with the word Plutinism, which means top 1% will be served. They'll be given everything. They're like the queen in an anthill. You know, everybody takes care of the queen. Well, these people will be like the queen. They get everything. Everybody else will be living at a subsistence level. And you can also call it return to the plantation, I think. And the jobs will always go to the lowest, one that's willing to work for the lowest wages. Corporations, in my opinion, need to be abolished altogether, abusing their power. They were given, private businesses were giving corporation power in return for serving the public good first. Each year to get their charter renewed, they had to say what they did for the public good. Now they serve themselves first. So I would call for the total abolition of private corporations. We definitely need a new constitution. We're in the space age. We have a horse and buggy constitution. But how would we go after, say, a world government, a global government? It seemed like the unions would be a good force, a good power. But is there anything else, or what can we do to make the unions stronger?
That's quite a challenge. I hope other people here will respond to that if it strikes your imagination as well. So I'd like to agree with you and disagree with you as briefly as I can because I spoke a long time. Clearly these agreements not only want to, but do and will bypass elected governments, local administrations, local regulations, national regulations. They set up the framework to do that, but they set it up within the context of the nation states. Each of these governments, each of these have to ratify these treaties because they are the ultimate enforcement. They are the muscle. They have the armies and the judicial systems to enforce the mechanisms of these treaties. In other words, if the treaty says that Chicago has to pay $100 million because our water is not for sale to Nestle, and Nestle lose with that $100 million, how are they going to collect that money? They don't have their own international armed forces. Now maybe they have that on the horizon, but the actual mechanisms that we're facing require the participation of the nation states, guided by the executives, which Marx accurately saw as the location for working out the common interests of the upper class, the ruling classes, but it requires their participation. So I don't think they are out to ruin the nation states so much as to bypass them, but also to work within them to use them for the enforcement of these provisions. WTO and TPP three-man commissions can rule whatever they want, but how are they going to collect the money? They don't have the force to collect the money, but the government has the force to collect the money, and the government will be legally obligated within their own system of laws to follow the treaty, because the treaty is the highest legal standard that there is, and therefore the collection agency and the enforcement agency are the states themselves, even as they emasculate, gut, eviscerate, and eliminate all the democratic aspects of government. They have the enforcement mechanism on hand to work in an integrated fashion. So I have to disagree with you that they want to ruin the nation states. I think they want to end any democratic aspects and limitations of that the nation states afford to the people to make reforms and limitations for them, but they want to maintain them. Then you ask the most challenging question of all: how are we going to create, because it is a global economy. Now, some people want to go back to horse and buggy, or before the horse and buggy, and you carry things on your back and everything is primitive. I think that's awful. I mean, I like the fact that medicine can cure many diseases and that medicine takes place because we have technology. I like the fact that when my hip went bad, they could cut out the bone and insert plastics and stuff like that. Yeah, so I think Marx was right, and the rest of them. We need to keep and capture the great benefits and the tremendous achievements that capitalism has brought, but bring it under popular control, and that means working class, fundamentally, with masses of people benefiting. I think the commune, the councils, the Spanish Revolution of 1936, the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, the Chinese Revolution, show that masses, that millions and millions of people can and do fight to take control of our destiny and create our own forms, whether it was the Paris Commune or the workers' groups in 1848, or the councils of soldiers and what did they have? They had soldiers Soviets, they had worker Soviets, and they had they had Soviets in some of the poor farm peasant communities. So there are democratic forms that can evolve that are based workplace and geographical based, that are complete substitutes for the existing state. They require the dismantlement of the existing state, which is mainly based on force and prison and laws and jails and so on and so forth. And they're establishing what is pretty much direct democracy, or at least a direct republic with recallable and so on and so forth. So, and then to link up. And this is a long revolutionary process, and that's all I want to say, because there are other people who want to speak, and I spoke a long time.
I just say one thing. They use direct war funds to create 27 private army, mercenary armies. So they're obviously going to replace all military systems.
Well, you may be right, but I'm cognizant of the fact that I spoke for an hour, and there are other people who want to speak, and we're running out of time, so I really have to cut myself short. You may be right. Well, you may be wrong.
It's happened.
Like the fact that you brought up the Madison, and it's such a repeat of all these previous other attempts at exercising power relations between the corporate and the people. And one of the big problems that it comes up over and over again is that people have this respect for law. But law and justice are two separate things. Law is a punishment, and justice has a bearing that's outside of law. Many laws are unjust. I mean, we've got, for example, corporations now have a full reign of all the states. They can have they can negotiate with local governments, state governments, and say we'll leave if you don't if you don't subsidize us by keeping us from paying taxes. They can negotiate with workers by saying if you don't take a pay cut, that we're going to leave. So they have all the leverage on their side. We don't have any kind of legal ability to exercise a power relation with the apparent power of corporations. And I think that's a big problem, that we really don't have this back and forth power relations in existence, and it doesn't look like it's going to come. Another thing I want to point out is that a lot of people in the Civil War did not like black people. They didn't care what happened to them. They only lynched them after they were freed. The big problem with bloody Kansas, for example, was whether it would be slavery or not. People who wanted to actually earn a living wage knew that they couldn't earn a living wage when they were competing with slaves. We are competing with slaves all over the world right now, and our wages are low because of the low-priced goods that are coming from slave labor all over the world. The Civil War is really not over yet. It's just a continuation, it's an expansion.
I think that's brilliant. I never thought of it that way exactly. The only, just to kind of add to or build on, perhaps disagree with what you said, but I agree that we don't have much legal leverage. The laws are constructed, written, and administered by people who are much closer to the corporate world than they are to working people's world. But I think we have leverage, and the unions intervened in Wisconsin precisely because we were developing our leverage and organization outside of their legal system to our own forms of action and our own organizations that would have been necessary to do that, which would have been local committees, people in different unions, community groups, people who are affected in healthcare, forming groups around our common self-interest to fight. And we would have drawn lessons from how the Democrats, the Republicans, and the different players would have been involved. And through that, we now begin to establish our own institutions. And following our good friend Lewis Powell, we take a strategic outlook and we advance our class interests, and we form our own forms of organization. How much of that's going to be within the law, how much of that's going to be out of the law, is really not fundamental, because the law can't stop us. They can use courts, they can use police, they can use injunctions, but it is true that there have been successful movements that over time have built up the infrastructure of human connections and awareness and organization. Powell was very clear. Long-term organization is a requirement. It's not the answer, but it's a requirement. It's a necessary tool. And just like if you want to go online, you better have some electronic communication device that'll get you there. And it was a necessary tool, and we can develop that. It won't be within the legal system. We'll take advantage of whatever the legal system gives us, and we've won. And if they say it's illegal and we have enough people, you know what? Fuck you.
Let's believe you.
Hi.
I know him. This is my godson. Nail me.
Hey, so the first thing that I had to bring up is you're talking about 1971, which is a period that has been mythologized as having a really pertinent and relevant role for and a contributing role of the youth of that generation, which now that I'm a youth of this generation, because I wasn't of one of that generation, the idea now is that what was in then, what was important then, what was the next step after college, but would be continuing because of our grandiose notions of what was important, has been stolen and has been transformed into something that is very marketable now, and something that I think agrees very philosophically and in its foundation with what the TPP is trying to accomplish by making a transnational sort of, a neoliberal sort of acceptance call that we're all in this together, and the concept that concept they can sell, and then they can use that concept to construct a notion of unity in the world that is stronger than, some trifling left-wingers over in the United States trying to create solidarity, this old notion that we need to be at war with some power that we can't even decide what it is, except for saying these mystical notions of the 1%, and we're all so angry and so angsty and we don't know what to do with ourselves. And meanwhile, you have these transnational organizations being very successful in unifying large groups of people somehow. I still understand how they don't get it, but some being able to organize. I'm trying to get into the question where I ask you how was that handled in the early 70s? Were similar losses made or victories for the ultra-right or the super center, what you want to call it, but the world of multinational interests trying to demean solidarity in any part of the world and promote a sort of faux unity of, like this gentleman said, a kind of global government which effectively governs on the behalf of corporations which can sell unity. And then another thing that I was going to ask a question about is, how is this is there any prediction? How is this going to affect immigration? Similar to how is it going to be similar to how NAFTA affected immigration? Are we looking at a massive influx on the West Coast? Just sort of tossing that out there. I also quickly wanted to get to a couple other very, very quick points. And then ultimately, how can there be an effective strategy? How can there be an effective strategy for seeming to be interested in solidarity to combat the way that an enemy has thus far made us look like people who would like to vilify them out of pettiness, and meanwhile have created a false concept of solidarity on their own? That's the big question.
I can't possibly respond intelligently because in the short amount of time, because you pose such good questions. So having said that, I'll try. I'll try to do what I know I can't do. If I understand you, part of your question revolves around the dilemma of how can we contest the corporate view that we're all in this together, it's one world market, and so on and so forth, with solidarity. Is that, and how, if that was done, how was that done in the 70s?
Yes.
Something like that?
Specifically the 70s one.
And you also asked about immigration.
Yes.
I hadn't thought about that, and maybe someone here has given it more thought than I, so I won't even try. But the question of, it's a global, the idea that there's a win-win solution to the globalization of capitalist economy, I have to think back for a second. Shame on you, you're making me think. Yeah, I know.
It's all your fault.
It was a very different moment. It's like the environmental movement was not about personal responsibility for how much plastic did I give up today or something like that. Not that it's nothing, it is something. But 90% of the pollution comes from industrial production. It was not about that. It was about the corporations are poisoning our water. So people in like the Fox Valley where I live now would take industrial pollutants released into the water and collect them and deliver them in corporate headquarters with crowds of people. The Fox, right. And there were all kinds of things like that. In other words, the cause and impact link between the corporations and the problems was made very direct. The women's movement that started with rap groups about how does male chauvinism, dominance affect my life and what can I do about it, where people came together and got a sense of we and we're going to do something about it, became towards a liberation movement and a liberation conception, and it went after insurance companies who wouldn't give them insurance or would give them different rates and stuff like that. So a lot of it was very directly linked to the corporate, and that's what Lewis Powell's talking about, that they're under attack. Their hegemony, the leadership of their ideas and their institutions and the validity of their institutions were under direct attack. So they were on the defensive, whereas now we're on the defensive. So was it because it was very, I won't say class conscious, but it was conscious of the direct sources. People weren't just saying war is a bad idea and we should love our neighbor, which was a wonderful thought, but they were blocking railroad trains and talking to GIs at centers where people were being drafted and people were going on the inside and making speeches or statements and passing out literature, and we were holding demonstrations outside, and conflicts, the police would attack us. Soldiers inside the military were refusing to fight. Some of them threw hand grenades into their officers' outhouses and killed them, called fragging. If you watch, anybody here seen the movie Sir, No Sir? Well, it completely whitewashes, eliminates the consciousness, the anti-imperialism that motivated so many people, but it does does a wonderful job of showing the extent of the opposition to the war and the subversion of that war by soldiers, including people in the intelligence units who would give either refuse to give the information they had or give false information to their superiors to screw up the war effort. Tied to going after people who made munitions like Dow Chemical that took gasoline and turned it into jelly that would burn through human flesh and bones. So the links were made very real and vivid and connected. And that was part of why they were on the defensive. And I don't know if there's a better answer other than when these issues affect our lives, to make a point of pointing out what the connections are to the institutions and then to the system itself, and then develop organizing around it. And I wish I could do better, Noah, but that's all I can say right now.
Talking about physical action connection.
Well, it was physical action, but it was organizing where people would go out in communities or talk to the other people who were affected. They wouldn't do it as isolated individuals, for the most part. If they did it at night when they wouldn't be seen, but mostly it was a lot of group activity.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Go ahead, Jan, take all the time. Shelley, what can I say?
I really, my ideas are pretty simplistic, and I'm not a great reader of Marx, although I did read Capital and some other things. But I get so scattered because there's so many different things that I wanted to bring up. And the first thing is that when I was down at Occupy, and we had all those signs out saying we are the 99%, and we were down at Jackson and LaSalle, and the people in the buildings there put up signs in the windows.
We are the 1%.
Saying we are the 1%. And I thought that was really, I thought it was extremely threatening, because I personally, my parents didn't amass a fortune, but they did participate in the capitalist system after World War II, and they developed a substantial nest egg. And now that has been taken away from me. And I'm thinking it's been what I would call extremely unfair. And I'm looking at how it is possible for people to be so unethical. And I realize the ethic is, I am smarter than you are, and therefore I am entitled to your money. And if I can figure out a way to get your money, that's not unethical. It's just because I'm smarter than you. And I think that being smarter than me means that you spend more time thinking about money than I do. And that means you're smarter and you're entitled to the money. And so this is interesting to me as a change in what is, it's a real understanding of what of how the other side thinks. And so that's one thing I wanted to talk about. And then, I just have I've written a little essay, what I sent in to people, about the difference between climate scientists and atomic scientists. And this does definitely not apply to all atomic scientists. But I went to a C2ST, which means Chicago Council on Science and Technology meeting. And the atomic scientists from Argonne and Fermi were there, and they were proudly expounding on the next generation of nuclear power plants, and completely blind to what has happened, because, why aren't they using their smarts to try to save the people who are being now destroyed by radiation from the nuclear power plants that have exploded? I hate to say this, but Chernobyl is not over. And Kishtim is not over, and nobody's even heard of Kishtim. But it was the one that exploded before Chernobyl. Then there was Chernobyl, and then there was 3 Mile Island, which didn't explode but just melted down, and then there was the one at Fukushima. And 3 of those, not counting 3 Mile Island, actually exploded. So, but they're not paying attention to that. They're saying, we're now developing the next generation. Climate scientists are out there every single minute of every single day trying to help us understand what's happening and what we're facing.
I'm sorry to interrupt, it's not really my place, but we have one last speaker and we only have a few minutes left. Could I be rude and ask you to summarize so that he can speak and then I'll respond to both of you?
Okay, so at the IDNR, when they were developing the regulations for fracking, I asked for a list of the people on the committee developing those regulations for an FOIA and immediately got a rejection. So they're not going to tell you who's on the committee, who's developing the regulations. And then I just wanted to say that since 1997, there has been no disagreement among scientists about climate change.
Thank you. Go ahead, Sean.
This is the last question, comment.
Yeah, this is not so much a question as an answer, I hope. Briefly,
Go to the mic.
Go to the
What happened
microphone.
is-
Go to the mic so that they can hear you, Sean.
Oh, they can hear me.
No,
You
it's
can just take it off of
case.
All right, anyway, what happened is that after World Wars I and II, the center of the capitalist order was screwed except for the U.S. And so we sort of got a free ride from the rest of it for several decades. During those decades, we looked like we being the U.S., looked like we were headed in a social democratic direction.
May we have your attention, please? The
Sure.
time is now 4:30. The library will close in 30 minutes. Internet service has now ended for today, and library card registration will end at 4:45. Thank you.
Vietnam was a symptom that had ended, and that right after that the U.S. realized, well, we can't do much anymore without talking to our buddies who were basically worthy of respect because they were now effectively competing with us for the first time in 30 years. So when that model shifted to the old model, which is what capitalism had been like before World War I, a lot of things changed in its wake. A huge number of things you could write volumes on, somebody should have. But that's really the big difference. So we went from being basically a national-based system, not just us, but all the rest of the world. Starting with the EU, it started to recombine in different ways. It wasn't called the EU then, it was called something else. My point is that that's changed, and we went back to the transnational model, which really had been capital from the beginning, from the 16th century. So that the period, say from World War I till the 70s, turned out to be just a pause.
So we're just about running out of time. Yes, please.
I just wanted to let people know that if they want to find out in depth about the TPP and get some activist kits about it, go to flushthetpp.org or popularresistance.org, and there's everything you want to know about it, including the effects on immigration
Oh, good.
and
So,
lots of activists.
in case it wasn't heard, wasn't picked up by the camera, the point was made that flushthetpp.org, which I had mentioned before, and what was the other one?
Popular Resistance.
Popularresistance.org/TPP, and you'll find out lots more. I just wanted to say that I forgot to thank News and Letters for their article in this January-February issue called on what happens after, which drove home for me again the necessity of looking for within the nature of the situation for the alternative that exists within, rather than just trying to impose our nice ideas from the outside, but how to work with what really exists. And thank you for the opportunity, and I hope this has been useful for you as it has for me.